Good day, everyone. Welcome to another great day, and welcome to a great new chance for you to join me live and for us to spend some time together. We're going to get started with the actual podcast in a second, and if you don't know what I mean by that, I'll explain that here. Excuse me, I'll explain that here for you in a sec. I'm so glad that you're here for us to spend a little time this morning talking about leadership, specifically talking about change. If you are here live, whatever platform you're on, just say hello and tell us where you're from in the comments of whatever platform you're on. We'd love to have you do that so we know who's here. It also gets you used to commenting because we hope that you'll do that. Because while you're here, I want you to just imagine that you're joining my guest and I for a cup of coffee or whatever beverage you would be having at whatever time of day it is for you. And so share your questions and your comments and your ideas, because doing those things will make for a better conversation between my guest and I, and make for a better podcast episode as well. And so if you didn't know, this will be a part of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You can learn more about that by going to remarkablepodcast.com. But what I'm going to do now, as you put in your comments and tell us where you're from, is I'm going to do a countdown, which is where we'll actually cut the recording to start the podcast itself. So Marissa, we'll go in 3, 2, 1. Change will happen. But what about making change happen? If you want to be a force for good, where you are and anywhere, you are a change maker. And so says our guest today. Be ready for one of the most meaningful and powerful episodes of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast this year. I've just met our guest. I'm excited to have him join us, and I'm so glad that you're here with us. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could be here live for future episodes on your favorite social channel. You can get all the information about those and get other information and interact with us by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn or remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook to do that. And today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Development Sessions. A Remarkable Development Session is a webinar for a new world. We know that we learn in interaction with others, but in a fractured, increasingly virtual world, the workshop experience has been shifted to a focus on simply delivering the content, leaving the application to you as an individual. So even if you love webinars, you've likely thought there has to be a better way, a way to make a webinar far better than they are. And if you've had that thought or had that wish, then go to kevineichenberry.com/remarkable development to learn more and register for an upcoming session on a valuable skill. And with all of that, it's time for me to bring our guest in. Here he is. If you're with us live, you can see him. We got lots of comments. I'll get to those in a second. But let me introduce you first to our guest today, who is Alex Budak. Alex is a social entrepreneur, faculty member at Berkeley Haas, and the author of Becoming a Changemaker. He teaches, speaks, and writes to help people make a positive impact in their lives, careers, communities, and society. At UC Berkeley, he created and teaches the course Becoming a Changemaker and is a lecturer and faculty director for the Berkeley Executive Education Programs. As a social entrepreneur, he's co-founded StartSomeGood.com, ran Sweden's most prominent social innovation incubator, Reach for Change, and helped Change.org to scale globally. He's given talks on leadership, entrepreneurship, and change making around the world, from Cambodia to Ukraine to the Arctic Circle, and at the White House, UN agencies, and leading companies. He's a graduate of UCLA and Georgetown, and he's our guest today. Alex, I'm so glad that you're here.
Kevin,
the wait is over, my friend.
Me.
Welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So while I put up some comments about where people are from, we've got St. Paul and Minnesota and Nairobi and North Carolina and Wisconsin and Michigan and more Michigan and Italy and India and New Jersey and Atlanta. They're from all over, Alex. So let's start here. Tell us about the journey. You didn't wake up when you were 10 and say, I want to be a change maker, at least not in those words. Like, what gets you to this place? Briefly, what gets you here?
So grew up and was born and raised in the Silicon Valley Bay Area. So entrepreneurship has always kind of been in the aura around me, but I never really knew what I wanted to do with that, other than that I hoped to make some type of positive difference. I went out to Washington, D.C. to study public policy in graduate school. I think about the first or second day, I realized I'm a little too entrepreneurial for this program. I've met amazing people, but most of them wanted to go work for big traditional organizations. And there's nothing wrong with that. But their vision of change was that change came through the World Bank, the UN, agencies like that. So I took a little time off and spent some time living and working in India. I noticed that there's a couple of folks joining from India. I was in Ahmedabad, India. And while I was there, I did some work volunteering with a local social enterprise, a grassroots group. And they were working with girls from the local community and using sport as a tool to teach healthy habits and leadership. And I didn't do anything that important with the group, to be honest. I was just a volunteer. But there on those dirt fields in Ahmedabad, I realized that there's quite literally change makers all around the world, people that want to make a difference, but just too many barriers getting in the way. I would meander the crazy, chaotic streets back to where I was staying, and my mind would just wander about how can we create a world where change makers all around the world feel like they have the tools, the resources, the ideas, the support they need to take action. And that's become really the red thread that's driven my whole career. As you mentioned, I was a social entrepreneur, so I co-founded an organization that tried to break down some of those barriers that stop people from enacting change. And then now just the greatest dream come true, to be teaching at UC Berkeley, where I developed and teach this class called Becoming a Changemaker. And it's the class that honestly, I wish I could have taken when I was just beginning my own changemaker journey. And it is so much fun. It's such a delight. And now this book that you mentioned kind of comes out of that class. And that's the quick synopsis of the journey.
So perhaps we'll get back to the class before we're done, but the word if we were playing a drinking game, Alex, and people were having to drink every time they heard the word changemaker, they wouldn't make it through the end of this. So since that's the name of the course, that's the name of the book, now is probably the logical time for you to tell us what it means. What does it mean to be a change maker?
So I take a radically inclusive lens on change making. And so my definition that I put forward, and this is what I've learned from working with thousands of folks around the world, simply a change maker leads positive change from wherever they are. So you'll see in that there's no mention of roles, no mention of titles. I believe that an entry-level product manager has just as much claim to that title of changemaker as a Nobel Prize winner. That it's this radically inclusive lens that you can apply to all of your work. You could be a changemaker engineer, a changemaker artist, a changemaker product manager. Sorry, that's a lot of changemakers. So if you are drinking, I've got you done.
Well, I don't know why I even said that, because it's kind of a silly thing to say. But yes, we had to say it a bunch of times. So I know that's easy to say intellectually. Okay, Alex, I can be a change maker, but I am a frontline supervisor, but I am a new product manager, but I am, I don't know, in inventory management in a big retail company, whatever it is. What do you really mean by that?
Well, let's start breaking down what we mean by leadership, when we think about change maker leadership. And I teach at a business school, but I think a lot of business schools do kind of a disservice the way we talk about leadership. We often talk about leadership through the lens of a single heroic act. So we think about Lech Walesa scaling the fence, or we think about Steve Jobs pulling the iPhone out of his pocket for the first time. Now, to be clear, there's a role for that type of courageous, heroic leadership. But I think when we put those leaders up on a pedestal, it's all too easy for people like us to look at them and say, well, I'm not naturally an extrovert like them, or I'm not naturally as charismatic, or I don't have that formal position of leadership that they do. Does that mean that I can't be a leader? But no, absolutely not. I believe that while leaders might be scarce, leadership is abundant. There may be only one CEO, only 5 vice presidents, but each of us can practice acts of leadership. And so one of the core concepts I put forward in the book is a brand new idea that I call micro-leadership. And so micro-leadership breaks leadership down into its smallest and most meaningful unit. That's simply a leadership moment. And so if you think about it, whether you're a vice president or you're an entry-level frontline worker, these leadership moments appear before you dozens of times per day. It might be in a meeting that you have where you notice that one of your colleagues has been kind of quiet the whole time, hasn't really spoken up. And you say, hey, no pressure, but I haven't heard your voice. Would love to hear what you think here if you feel comfortable. Or maybe in a meeting, it's having the courage to say no when everyone else is saying yes. Or maybe it's being willing to stay late to help a new colleague clean up after their first event, right? All of these are small little leadership moments. But when we shift from waiting for permission from someone else to say, okay, Kevin, you have this title, you're now officially a leader, to instead say, no, I'm going to seize these leadership moments when they appear before me. And each individual moment isn't too much. It's not too big of a step. When you look back collectively and you've done a dozen of these per week, you go, wow, I'm actually developing as a leader. And that's the way we can start shifting what it means for leadership to be something that they do to something that I do.
So obviously this is a podcast about leadership. So we could spend a lot of time talking about changemaker leadership. And I did want to get to micro leadership. So I want to ask you a couple more things about that. But I want to say to those of you who are with us live, if you have questions or comments, feel free to share them. That's your role here, is to only be a sponge. So if you've got something to share or ask, please do. We'll try to incorporate that as much as we can. I love those examples, Alex, about what it means to be a micro leader or for micro leadership. In the book, you talk about 4 keys to doing that. Can you dive into that just a little bit more?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with just a story so we can kind of anchor it, so we can kind of understand. So I know we have people all around the world, maybe some basketball fans, maybe not, but you can at least appreciate that the NCAA basketball tournament is the biggest tournament of the year for college.
Okay,
basketball.
You are speaking my language, Alex, just saying.
Who's your team, Kevin?
I'm a Boilermaker, and we are in the top 5.
Yeah, it's a good season to be.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead. Enough of that. Go on. Yes.
I'm a proud UC Bruin, so I have to throw that in there. But so this is talking about the women's NCAA tournament. This is 2 years ago, middle of COVID, where all the men's teams were in one location, all the women's teams were in another location. And there was a discrepancy. The men's weight room was pretty good, and the women's weight room was quite literally a stack of dumbbells. Like, that's it. And obviously a huge injustice and a disparity. And you can imagine with 64 teams, let's say 15 players per team, plus coaches and trainers, there's thousands of people that saw this discrepancy. But one player, Sedona Prince on the Oregon basketball team, she said, well, this doesn't seem quite right. This was her leadership moment, right? She saw that there was something. And instead of just letting it sail by, as presumably so many other people had done, Sedona said, it doesn't feel right to me. Let me step up and do something about it. So she takes out her phone, films a 38-second clip. She posts it on TikTok and then reposts it on Twitter. And she talks about the disparity. She shows what the women's weight room is actually like. It cut with scenes of the men's weight room. Posts it, goes to bed, wakes up the next morning, and she's got 10,000 retweets. She's got an invitation to join Good Morning America, and she's catalyzed a national conversation. Steph Curry, among other pro basketball players, are weighing in on it. Now, she didn't have a platform. She was just kind of your average basketball player, but she decided in that moment to do the first step of micro leadership, which is to give yourself permission. You could imagine that there's tons of other people that had seen this exact same scene, but for whatever reason, they said, oh, well, it's systemic, or, someone else will take care of that. No, she decided to give herself permission. Secondly, believe it and be it. She said, well, you know what? I don't need to talk to my coach about this. I'm not talking to my other players about this. I'm just going to be that change in the moment. Thirdly, it's rooted in service. It wasn't an action about her. She was serving her other women athletes and the sort of sense of justice. And then fourthly, you do it again and again and again. Micro leadership, as we talked about, any one single moment is not that big, won't have that much of an impact, most likely. But when you start doing it again and again and again, and you look back and you realize, wow, well, I'm really stepping into my leadership potential. In the case of Sedona Prince, she's then used her platform, which of course grew exponentially as a result of this. She continues to use her platform to advocate for others, especially around issues of racial justice in sports. So she does it again and again and again.
And still, back to our earlier point, everybody, without a position. Like, she wasn't the women's NCAA tournament, anything. She was a player on one of the 68 teams. And so that's a great story. It's the story you tell in the book. I want to step back now because we've been talking about change leadership. It's really only one of 3, I would say, of the big parts of the change maker journey that you describe in the book. And there are 2 others. So change leadership is certainly part, but there are 2 other pieces that we probably need to talk a little bit about. So go ahead.
Sure. So we can begin with change maker mindset. That's your set of beliefs, the way that you see the world and your role in shaping it. Now, I've got some original research we can talk about here, but to sort of frame it up, I really love the words of poet Amanda Gorman. She delivered the poem, The Hill We Climb, at the inauguration of Biden and Harris. And in it, the final 3 lines, I think, are a beautiful poetic representation of what it means to have a changemaker mindset. She says, "For there is always light if we're brave enough to see it, if we're brave enough to be it. For there's always light." This idea that we are facing real challenges right now, whether you think on the kind of world level, thinking about climate change and growing distrust among institutions and people, or just on an individual company level, like digital transformations. Those are hard. So this idea, for there's always light, that today is tough, but tomorrow can be better. And I can play a role in making sure that it is. For there's always light. If only we can see it. So sometimes as a change maker, you've got to be able to see things that others may not see quite yet. Being able to see systems that need to be changed or status quos that need to be disrupted. We often talk about vision as being something that the CEO has, right? The CEO is the one that sets the vision. But no, I think each of us can have that sense of vision, being forward-looking, imagining what that future could be like. But if only we're brave enough to be it. Being a change maker, having a change maker mindset takes courage. It's always rooted in courage. It can feel really scary. Speaking from my own experiences as a change maker and supporting so many others, it's scary to put yourself out there, to sort of stand up and say, look, I've got an idea for change and I'm going to disrupt things. I'm going to go up against the status quo bias. And you may not know exactly what you'll do. You may not have the answers. You may not have a perfect plan, but do you have the courage to get started?
You likely, let's rephrase that. You likely don't have all the answers, right? You have perhaps the right questions, perhaps you have a vision, but even if you have a vision for what the change is, and I think that's one of the reasons why people get stuck or are afraid to try, is because I don't know all the steps, or I don't know what I will run into. And yet until we step boldly out, we've got no shot, right? So I really love that, the section on mindset is so important for all of us. And I think you talk about it so well right there. There's a chapter though, that first of all, the title of the chapter, and this is inside baseball about how Kevin reads. I'm reading the title of this chapter saying, man, that'd be a great book title. Because it gets at something that I think people struggle with all of the time. And Alex, by the way, has no idea what I'm about to say. So The title of the chapter is, and the idea is, confidence without attitude, which I clearly left out a letter in there. So we'll take that off. Confidence without attitude. So people have a love-hate relationship with the word confidence. And you talk about it in this chapter as it relates to being, in terms of being a change leader. So a change maker leader. So talk about what you mean by confidence without attitude.
Yeah, so as change makers, we often need to hold multiple polarities at the same time. So think about, if you're trying to lead change, you've got to have this sense of urgency because change requires action, but also have this long-term view because change takes time. So you got to kind of be both and. Think the same with confidence and humility. That I see so many leaders that are either one or the other. So either super confident and not very humble, or way too humble and not too confident. Or a number of leaders make the mistake to go kind of that messy middle where they're a little bit confident and a little bit humble. Now, in my work at UC Berkeley, I get to teach a wide range of students, everywhere from 18-year-old freshmen all the way to senior executives in Berkeley executive education programs, so 50, 60, 70-year-olds. And so wide range. We see people come in with different values when it comes to humility and confidence. The point I try to make to them is you've got to be both and at the same time. To be a change maker, you've got to have the confidence to stand up and say, look, I got this idea, I got this plan. And like you said, I don't know exactly what will happen. Maybe you just got questions. Maybe you just got a belief you've got to work on these things. But to even have that confidence to say, look, I want to stand up. But also you've got to have that humility, the humility to say, I don't have all the answers. I'm failable as a leader, to develop concepts like psychological safety in your team to model that, and to make other people want to feel part of the change with you. What we often see as leaders is that we do a little bit of both. We sort of get a little bit confident and a little bit humble, but neither to the point where either is effective. Instead, I like looking at both at the same time. I tell the story in the book of Gwenyi Wang. She's the founder of a company called Tribeless. And so they work with companies around the world and teach emotional intelligence and empathy. And so this was a couple of years ago, and by all outward measures, she was thriving. She was on the cover of magazines in Malaysia, and she had a company that seemed to be just hyper scaling, hyper growth. But internally, she felt this great discontent. She felt like she was no longer the leader that her team needed. She's a visionary. She's a product person. And she realized with the company quickly scaling, they needed someone who was more of a finance person, more of an operations person. And she kept trying to be that leader, but it just wasn't her. And so she told me that after a few months of really difficult conversations with her team, with her co-founder, she decided to take the pretty bold step to step back, to go into a chief product officer role, step back so someone else could step up as CEO. And what I love about her story is that she's both and. She had the confidence to found this company in the first place, but also in stepping back, which we often see as a step of humility, actually takes a lot of confidence. It took the confidence for her to say, look, I understand what my strengths are. I understand what the team needs. And I'm going to make that hard decision to not just leave the company, but I'm going to step back so someone else can step up and have that confidence. But all that was rooted in humility by her understanding what her strengths are, what some of her weaknesses are, and deeply wanting to serve the team, thinking what would be best for this organization, not just for me. And so Gwen, I think, is a great example of someone who's confident without attitude, who's both confident and has humility at the same time.
So a question has come in and it's really long. And so I'm not going to put it on the screen, but I think the heart of the question is, what about positive changes that are building on past changes that were also good? I think what I'm reading in the question is we may need to disrupt something that's already good to get something even better. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So first, let's recognize that there's something very real called the status quo bias. If you've ever felt like it's hard to change things, it's because social science proves that it is. Behavioral economists Samuelson and Zeckhauser are the ones that coined that term, but they show that we tend to overvalue what we already have, even when the alternative is empirically better. Now, when it comes to disruption, and of course, I'm coming to you from the Silicon Valley, which has a long history.
Oh, we have lost Alex. Alex has, I think, he's back.
Lost you for a second. Yeah. So yeah, we need to think about how we lead change and how we bring others along with the change. There's a lot of people here in Silicon Valley that say, oh, what's your leadership style? Oh, I'm a Steve Jobs. But here's the truth. Most people who self-identify as Steve Jobs probably aren't a Steve Jobs. And so I think there's a role for us to be
almost by definition, Alex.
Exactly. There's a role for us to be inclusive in the way that we lead change. So we've got to be disruptive. We've got to push things forward. But I think also as disruptors, innovators, to lead inclusively. There's a concept that Jess Remington and Joanna C. put forward, which is called designing with the beneficiary. There's a bad habit, I think, that we design for the beneficiary. We sort of say, this is what people need, and let's go design it. But instead, I think we need to take into account what people actually want and involve them in the change with us.
And we can do that at all sorts of levels. All of this, everybody, is leading to the third part of the Changemaker journey. We've talked about the Changemaker mindset and Changemaker leadership, but the third part is Changemaker action, which is, Alex, you can't keep from, everything you've said, you're making the point because you continue to talk about the action we must take. So talk a little bit more about this third part of the journey.
So I teach it at Berkeley, which of course has one of the best math departments in the world. And I make the promise to my students that I'm not at all qualified to teach math at Berkeley. So I only have one single math equation I teach in my entire class.
And there it is.
There you go.
I anticipated it.
I love it. So it's the sum of your mindset and your leadership multiplied by your action. What does that tell us? It doesn't take a Nobel Prize winner in math to know that when you multiply a number by 0, the result is 0. Even if you multiply a huge number by 0, it's still 0. And so that's how we can understand our impact as change makers. We've talked so far about developing that mindset, that idea of kind of seeing the change, being the changed. We've talked a little bit about the leadership skills to bring others along with you. But if all you do is sit on that, if you never actually take any action, you can never have any impact as a change maker. Action is the catalyst that drives your impact. And so the third and final part is about action. How do you put together your mindset and your leadership? And how do you take those challenging but crucial first steps of action?
So give us a couple of thoughts about how to do that, right? We have the mindset, or we've developed the mindset. We care about something passionately enough. We recognize that we don't have to have a role in order to do something, and yet now we must do something. So what are a couple of keys to taking action to become a change maker?
Here's one of my favorite research studies that's come out in the last few years. So it's a bunch of Italian researchers looking at startups that were in an Italian incubator, and they had a most simple intervention. All they did was they took half of these companies and they taught the founders the scientific method. So that's hypothesis testing and so on. That's the only intervention. And what were the results? The entrepreneurs that had learned the scientific method were more likely to pivot, so that's make changes in strategy, changes in direction, and also generate almost 2x the revenue. So why is that? Is the scientific method some powerful magic key? No, of course not. But what it does is think about being a scientist in a lab. So the scientist, she's sitting there, she's titrating chemicals, whatever scientists do, and the hypothesis doesn't come out the way she expects. Does she go, oh, I'm a terrible scientist, look at me, I failed? No, she goes, I learned something. That's great. And I think that's what that lesson tells us about leading change, about taking impact, taking action, is that we've got to take the personal sting out of failure. Start seeing your action as a series of hypotheses. You're just making guesses, right? Kevin, as you mentioned early on, we never really know exactly what will happen. We may have a vision, we have some ideas, but you don't know till you put it out there. And so can you think as a scientist that when something doesn't go your way, well, you don't think I'm a failure, I shouldn't be leading change, this thing has no potential. No, you go, great, I've just learned that this isn't the right path. Now let's pivot, let's change direction. It's not personal. I've just learned something and let's go forward from there. So I think there's a lot we can do with reframing our relationship to failure. And then the second thing I'll share is a tool that I've created. It's called the Changemaker Canvas. You can check it out if you'd like. It's at changemakerbook.com/canvas. And in the book, I have a whole chapter walking you through it. But it's a tool that I've developed in service of people like you that find change really scary and overwhelming. And by the way, if you feel like change is scary, you're in good company, because even the most senior executives I work with, they still find it scary. And so the Changemaker Canvas breaks change down from overwhelming and complex to small, actionable, meaningful steps. And along the way, you spend some time up front talking through things like, well, what's the core problem I'm solving? What are the root causes? How will we plan for scalability and sustainability? You kind of walk through all these things. And then when you do, your change effort shifts from a strategy question to an execution question. You do some of the strategy work up front, including hypotheses you want to test, and then it's just a matter of taking that first step. There's so much complexity in change, and so it helps you get a little bit more clear on what those first steps are, so that way you stop getting in your own way and just take action.
Yeah, I really love that. So there's something that you mentioned earlier, and I mentioned in the introduction. It's a large part of your work today, and that's this course, Becoming a Changemaker. And so I'd kind of like to, as we start to wrap up a little bit, I would ask you this. What have you learned from having taught the course, or what has the course taught you about being a change maker?
There's a phrase I learned maybe a semester into teaching, which I love, which is one person teaches and two people learn. And I think that's a powerful way to think about your own leadership as well. That, of course, I'm the professor, I'm standing at the front of the room, but I learn a ton from my students. And that's the greatest joy, is that I think instead of thinking that I have all the answers about change making, even though I've written a book and whatever, I'm constantly learning. And having that sort of growth mindset, that sense of curiosity, in the book I talk about it as being students always. Having that mindset allows you to open up to so much more. And well, of course, I'm talking here in the context of sort of the professor-student relationship. I think it's also applicable to leaders of all types, that we often think when we get in a formal position of power that we have to have all the answers, or sort of, okay, I'm CEO, that means I've learned everything. But no, I think it's so important to be thinking about, what can everyone else be teaching me? Because the magic of the classroom is when each of us are contributing. On the first day, I say, look, for this to be an amazing class, each of you are now co-producers. We're all in this together. The 50 of us are going to be creating this class. It's not me creating it for you. It's all of us creating it together. And that's a lesson I've tried to bring into my own change-making work, even outside of the classroom.
I love that. Before we really do start to wrap up, Alex, is there anything we haven't talked about that you wish we had?
Let me just share one more thing, which is we think about being a change maker. I think it ties a number of our themes together. It's just the importance of failure. Failure can feel really scary, but it's one of the things that is central to the class that I teach and to this book. But it's one thing to sort of intellectually understand, okay, to be a change maker, you've got to fail. It's another thing to actually practice it. So here might be a little challenge for some of our community here listening and watching today. In my class at Berkeley, we spend an entire week talking about failure. We look at case studies, we look at some frameworks, some empirical data. And then towards the end of class, I put up a slide which simply says, go fail. And students start looking around like, what's going on? I put up the next slide and it goes, okay, you have 15 minutes. You have to go leave the classroom. You have to go ask her something. get rejected, get a no, and you cannot come back until you've gotten that no. And so my students start looking around all nervously, like, oh my gosh, is this for real? I say, look, I'm going to be at the front of the classroom, happy to provide you some mentorship, some coaching, some advice. But yeah, I'm serious. Get out there, go fail. And so perhaps like many of your listeners, maybe members of your community, these are high achieving students. They're used to doing things sort of the quote right way. So the idea of failing on purpose is really scary. So they shuffle outside of the classroom really nervously. It's a slow walk out of the classroom. But then
do you have a checklist on how I'm supposed to do this?
Exactly. They come back and the energy is just off the charts. They're so elated. And we see that one of two things happens. For about 1/3 of students, they go out, they ask for something. They're sure they'll get rejected. And they get a yes. I think about one woman who went to the cafe downstairs and she asked for a free orange juice. And to her surprise, the barista said, okay. And she said, okay, can I have 2? He said, yeah, okay. 3, unfortunately, he cut her off there. But you got 2 orange juices, and she brought the 2 orange juices back to the class. And it's fun and it's silly. But of course, the lesson there is that so often our first failure is that we don't even ask for something that we want in the first place. Then for the other about 2/3 of students, they dutifully do get rejected. They get a no. But instead of coming back dejected or feeling bad about themselves, it's actually the opposite. They are sort of proud of themselves for putting themselves out there. They realize that failure isn't fatal, that no one laughed at them, and a bit more self-confidence because they said, look, if I can ask for this silly thing, like, letting a construction worker, asking a construction worker, can I drive your bulldozer? Which fortunately he said no to. If you get comfortable with those silly no's, then imagine what you can do when you actually care about something, when you really want that to really make that pitch. And so I think as change makers, we can start changing our relationship to failure to get more comfortable with it.
Oh, I love that exercise in that story. So as we start to wrap up, I want to shift gears on you. And I know you've listened to the podcast, so you might know what I'm going to ask. But the question is, so what do you do for fun, Alex?
Well, for fun, so I'm a new dad. So I've got a little guy who's turning 2 this week. And so that takes up a lot of my time and my energy in a really wonderful way. But outside of that, then love sports, love working out, and in a pre-COVID and pre-child world, love to travel. It's taken a bit of a hit recently, but love traveling.
Perfect. And I see a shelf of books behind you, some of which I recognize the spines, even though I can't see the words. What are you reading these days, Alex?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a dad. So honestly, a lot of what I'm reading is toddler material. So let me share my favorite toddler book and then also my favorite sort of grown-up book. So my favorite toddler book right now is a book called What Do You Do With an Idea by Kobi Yamada. It's this beautifully illustrated book, and it's simple and it's profound and it's powerful. And it's about this child who has an idea that keeps following them. And they try to figure out, well, what do you do with an idea? It's a beautiful book. And then for the grown-ups listening, the book that I'm reading.
No, for the grown-ups, we probably need to read that one.
That's right.
You want the truth.
Okay, for someone who doesn't want a picture book, then the non-picture book version. It's a great book. I'm about halfway through. It's called Different by Youngmi Moon. She's a professor at Harvard Business School. She's an expert on branding. But what I like about the book is that it's, a branding lens, but the lessons are applicable to everything. It's about how do you sort of stand out in a world that's becoming more and more the same. And I think there's cool lessons there on leadership, on life, and then, of course, on branding and business strategy, too.
Alex, last question. Where can we learn more about the book? We are talking with Alex Budak, the author of Becoming a Changemaker. Where can we learn more? Where can we get the book? Where do you want to point people? Where do you want to send them?
Head on over to changemakerbook.com. You can take an index at changemakerbook.com/index to get a test for what your greatest strength as a changemaker is. Is it your mindset? Is it your leadership? Is it your action? And then would love to connect with folks on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on the platform and would love to hear from you in your changemaker journey. And go ahead and follow me there. And I share lots of resources, tools, ideas, and connections for changemakers.
And so if you happen to be live and you happen to already be on LinkedIn, that should be very easy to do. So I hope that you'll do that, whether you are live or whether you're listening to the podcast sometime later. So now I have a question for all of you who are watching or listening, whenever it might be, because change making never goes out of style. The question is, now what? What are you going to do as a result? So maybe you got some ideas today about the mindset and the idea of leading change and making a difference through change, but what action are you going to take? Because if you take no action after today, this was of limited value to any of us, even though Alex and I had a good time. In terms of your investment of 30 plus minutes of your time, what's the point unless you go take some action? So I hope that you will do that. Alex, thanks again for being here. It's such a pleasure to have you. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm glad we had the chance to do it.
That was a fun conversation, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
And everybody, we'll be back next week with another episode of, and we'll be back for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll see you all next week. Thanks, everybody.